hopefully another one, an interesting afternoon of discussion. What we're here for today is affirmative action. Or a panel discussion on affirmative action. When Julie and Ron came through earlier this year, it seemed to spark a lot of conversation. And so we decided as a sort of a follow-up to that we would have this discussion with some various people here about affirmative action, because it seemed to bring a lot of conversation made in the classes. So affirmative action, what is it? Who does it affect? Why does it exist? That seems to be a lot of questions that are going on right now. I have a definition that was taken from the internet, from Info, please. And it says, in the United States, government programs overcome the effects of past societal discrimination by allocating jobs and resources to members of specific groups, such as minorities and women. The policy was implemented by federal agencies enforcing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 2 executive orders, which provided that government contractors and educational institutions receiving federal funds develop such programs. And it goes on and on and on, all right? There's enough paper. You could probably fill up every piece of paper in school with affirmative action type information. Affirmative action was set into motion over 40 or almost 40 years ago by President Johnson. We have all heard of affirmative action cases gone wrong. People hired who were less qualified than other candidates. People accepted into schools over people who may have been more qualified. Hiring quotas. And these complaints are actually given by both sides of the argument. We have gathered 6 people of various backgrounds and occupations here. No one here is a true expert on affirmative action if one such person does indeed exist. They are all here to lend a certain amount of experience and expertise to the discussion. Please listen actively. Think questions through thoroughly, and be patient as we try to shed a little bit more light on a very controversial and very fascinating topic. Now our panelists are, on the far end, we have Jay Finch. Jay is he's a member of the senior class. He's in policy debate, and last year he was the president of Delta Omega. Sitting next to Jay is Brendan Salmon. Mr. Salmon is a 1993 graduate of St. Ignatians High School. Attended Loyola College of Maryland, graduated in 1997. And I'm going to botch this, friends, so I apologize. Is it Louvain? Louvain. He went to Louvain, Belgium, not even the Catholic University, where he got his master's degree in theology, and he's currently a theology teacher here. Next to him is Mr. Marty Dibbets, another theology teacher. He's been here for 22 years. He had his master's degree from John Carroll University. Next to him is Mr. Dan Doubauer. He is the Associate Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Case Western Reserve University, where he's been in that position for 5 years. 4 years previous to that, he was in graduate admissions, and he has a degree in industrial and organizational psychology. Next to him is Mr. Milton Turner. Milton Turner is a graduate in 1981 from St. Ignatius High School in Georgetown, 1985, and he's been employed in modern languages since 1987. And on the end is Joseph Schneider, St. Rose Parish. He's a wrestler, a member of the Young Republicans, and he's a member of the junior class. And what we're going to do is I have a portable microphone. Some of the gentlemen here are going to have a brief prepared statement. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to walk around and ask you if you have any questions. And we will pose those questions to our panel and see how it goes from there. Okay? And I will throw it out to the panel right now. If anyone would like to pick up a microphone and start talking, that would be great.
Okay, I guess I can do a short straw. When a lot of my students found out I'm supporting the question is, are you for or against? And unfortunately, I think that's indicative of much of our mindfulness today, that we sort of need to divide things into categories to make them understandable. And I believe that on several of the issues, deeper mindfulness is reduced because of that, because the dichotomy is set up so that one may be understood. And sometimes issues, especially issues like this, ultimately can't be reduced if they're going to be mindfully engaged. So I want to situate the issue of affirmative action beyond the current equivocation too often perpetuated by contemporary debates on the matter, to reduce the complexity of programs seeking to engender the good of human relations, as I believe this to be, to a simple dichotomy of right and wrong, to my mind, impedes deeper mindfulness on this issue. And I think that's what we're really here to do, is to have a deep mindfulness about this. I would first say that it is myopic to assert parity between affirmative action and racism. Where racism declares the absolute superiority of one race, affirmative action is seeking to level the playing field and is not energized by the direct denigration of other races. I believe that there is a profound need in America to engage, understand, and celebrate all ethnicities and races that make this country what it is, as I believe they all bear a depth of richness in understanding the world. The question that I ask in light of this is whether affirmative action is the best procedure for accomplishing its intended goals. To answer briefly, I would say that while affirmative action is a step toward leveling the playing field, it is a step we must move beyond, and here is my reason. Although affirmative action is not racism, it cannot be denied that it is an action that operates by privileging one race or ethnicity over another. It seeks to do away with the very action it is forced to use. In this way, it bears a strong resemblance to, for example, military action, which uses violence to try to stop an apparent greater violence. Proponents of certain military interventions would argue that there are times when violence is acceptable to stop an even greater threat. I believe that we may argue the same for affirmative action, that when a people or peoples have been stripped of their dignity because of their ethnicity, there is a kind of privileging that seems necessary to overcome this condition. However, just as in military conflicts, I believe we may find also in affirmative action a power greater than that of any human means to achieve the desired goal. In military conflicts, and this is where I may tend to be a bit of an idealist, I firmly believe that there is no power greater for achieving peace than the cross of Christ. And I believe that the same applies to this issue. Concretely, this means that in my personal dedication to the Lord and our Savior Jesus Christ, the inherited burden I receive is a history of which I am part. I therefore believe it to be an acceptance of the cross, to sacrifice my own rights as understood by American justice and instead help to level the playing field. To bear the sins of our past is to listen to the voices of past suffering and oppression. While I am not directly responsible for America's tumultuous history, I would maintain that it is required of Christians to share in that burden and, like Christ, absorb sin without repelling it. If this means allowing certain races a privileged status, then it is a task to be taken and suffered in joy, but done so with the hope of bringing to light that affirmative action, this human method of trying to mandate love, is incapable of achieving what only the cross of Christ can, the union between all of God's children through Him, with Him, and in Him. In other words, as a human means of seeking to overcome sin and to promote unity, affirmative action is ultimately incapable of accomplishing what only a divine power can, just in the same way as war perpetuates the violence in its attempt to end violence, so too the affirmative action actually perpetuate race privileging in its hope of ending this. Because of this, it may have a good, and it does, I believe, have a good, but it is ultimately a good that we still must seek to be more mindful of and to move beyond. Ultimately, since it is a human means, it just doesn't have the power or the capability of touching the human heart in the way that the gospel of Christ can. Which is not to say that it is not congruent with the cross of Christ, but ultimately it is not equivalent to the cross of Christ. Thank you.
If you look at the handout that I prepared, I don't know if I sounds, if I'm understanding Mr. Salmon right, that he and I disagree. But I want to first start with the third point, which is an argument on my handout, and the first premise in an argument, that racism is wrong. Racism is wrong. Racism is ugly, it is evil, it is sinful, it is wrong, it is repulsive. I can't think of any other words to point out how bad racism is. And then notice in that argument, because affirmative action is racist, therefore affirmative action is wrong. All the time. Even as a temporary means to men. So, I'll pass the line on.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm actually doing quite a few different things as I've been listening to the first gentleman talk. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that, yes, I agree racism is wrong, but it continues to exist, and will probably continue to exist for quite some time unless we really take some steps toward ending it in different ways. And at the university level, I can tell you that affirmative action, at least, and more importantly, the results of the Michigan case, where they were looking at how race and ethnicity is used in a selection process for admission, I still believe it's a very important thing. What I like about it, and I'll talk about in a second, is it's kind of gotten a little bit more global in terms of how we look at demographic characteristics. But more importantly, just from reading applications and having the opportunity to see the geographic distribution, the cultural distribution, the advantage distribution, if you will, across this country, that there really is a difference, and a lot of it has to do in terms of the resources available to some groups and not to others. Just to kind of bring it back to the university, however, you'll see that with the Michigan case, and I don't know how many are familiar with this case, there was a lawsuit brought against the University of Michigan and their use of assigning points to people of color, or as they were calling them, minorities, in the process of admission, and that was actually brought into question, and the points piece of it was struck down, that you can't assign points. However, what did come out of it is that you can continue to use race and ethnicity and other factors like diversity of background, economic background, those kinds of things. But if you're going to use them, you have to demonstrate that there is a compelling interest. And at the university level, that compelling interest is that diversity in your student body is part of an important educational experience. The other thing is that you have to demonstrate that you narrowly tailored your programs so that it meets organizational goals, in this case the educational benefit, and that you're not just recruiting, in this case people of color, to have people of color, but that they actually meet an organizational goal. But also that as you're going through it, that you'll see that it's a very specific thing where the University of Michigan used to assign points for the 28,000 applications that they would receive, because obviously that's a lot for a staff of 10 or 15 counselors to read, and now they hired 1,600 readers to read every single application so that each person has the opportunity for individual consideration. That was the bigger issue, is that some of these applications weren't necessarily being read in the way that others were. And the whole idea behind narrow tailoring is that on the individualized review, that on this individual basis of review, that everybody has an equal chance to gain a seat in a class, and it takes away the burden of the point system on one group versus another. I'm starting to confuse myself, so I think what I'm going to do is just going to stop at this point and pass it on, and then hopefully be able to answer questions in a moment.
Good afternoon. I'm definitely in favor of affirmative action. Affirmative action is not confined to race. Affirmative action, first of all, is often dealt with in the areas of employment and of higher education. We're automatically talking to selectivity. You may have one position and 10 applicants. That means 9 very qualified applicants are not going to be accepted to begin with. Universities have a particular number of seats available. We're automatically talking about a selection process where qualified applicants are not going to be accepted. The idea of affirmative action is that there were people who didn't even get the chance to apply, who didn't get through the door. There were, besides the 9, another 4 or 5 that should have been able to at least participate in the process. That does not make it automatically racist, therefore not automatically wrong. We practice this here at school through legacies and a preference to Catholics because of a greater good. So there are advantages to it, the idea of affirmative action, taking steps towards providing an environment for which you see there is a need. Affirmative action does not privilege African Americans and minorities. Chris Rock had a joke in a concert that any white person in the room would not want to change places with me and be black, and I'm rich. By being black does not automatically make you a privileged race and oh, you're automatically going to get through the door. There still is racism. There are still multiple obstacles to overcome. It doesn't automatically make the minority the majority or the privileged race. That's why there's still, blacks and Hispanics are still heavily underrepresented in many businesses, particularly in middle and upper management, still heavily underrepresented in higher education. So we have the programs, yes, it's not perfect, but it still also has not accomplished what it needs. We still have a very long way to go, even with this imperfect process. So should we say, forget it, let's make things get worse? Or actually look at the real problems? Unfortunately, I think most often it's a question, as we said before, privilege, but of those who feel that they're losing their privilege, or someone's going to take my spot. It should be more a question of what is really at stake. We're talking often about competition and selectivity. We're actually making it much more open.
I'm afraid I don't have any prepared remarks, but I'll just put my 2 cents in right now. Concerning the lack of job distribution for minorities, to the best of my knowledge, that stems from poor education, which comes to them, which is a result of poor economic situation for them. And which really reminds me of, when you think about what's going on really in the country, it has to do with low economic standards of minorities. Many minorities, unfortunately, are in poor shape economically. And however, that means also whites who are in poor economics. I think that in this nation today, we tend to focus a lot on, we think a lot about race. I just think that maybe we need to realize that, on the contrary, according to what our esteemed speaker a few months ago said, that we have to go to race to get over race. I think that we need to instead once just abandon the whole idea of black and white, Hispanic. We need to look at people as people, and to just say that someone's race doesn't make him better than me, and someone's race doesn't mean I need to help him because he's black. I need to give him extra privilege in order to get into a college or a job because he's black, rather than to treat people equally. And also we've heard, and we'll probably continue to hear a lot about diversity. I think that diversity already exists because I'm different from him, and we're the same race. We're not the same people, not the same person. We contribute different things just because of the way humanity is, which is different. Every person is different. Someone's race, which is completely out of his control, doesn't mean that he is better or he is better than me or that I'm better than him because of my race is out of our control. And I don't think that it's true that just half a century ago, or about half a century ago, or more, the people were treated unfairly by their race. But I think that affirmative action is almost the same thing, if not, it's basically the opposite of that. And that we're saying that minorities need our help because they're minorities. I think it's time that we start letting people stand on their own 2 feet and say that the greatest thing that we can do for you is to treat you equally because you are.
I agree with Mr. Turner. I'm pro-affirmative action. And the reason I'm pro-affirmative action is because in the theoretical world in which we revoke affirmative action policies, there will still be racism. And I understand that this is a false system, but it is ultimately a mandate policy to help us achieve, to help us overcome racism. Unless we build racism and destroy that, there's always going to be a need for affirmative action because there's just barriers inherent in racism. There has been. Today it seems like people get upset because somebody, John Smith, doesn't get a job because of some other race. Well, that's always been the story. Just last time the guy was black. People seem to get upset because people are underqualified, but nobody really knows what the qualifications are. What merits one person to be better in such standards than someone else. When I was applying to a college, I read under its affirmative action policies, which wasn't really a policy because they don't keep point system like University of Michigan, but it said, all other things equal, the odds in favor of female engineer. Even out of the context of race, they still recognize that there's barriers for people who aren't from the good old boy party or not a 6'9" athlete or dad hasn't bought a building for them. They look at the fact that there hasn't been preferential treatment for them before, and now that they have this opportunity to apply with all the other qualifications up to the standards of the university, they have an opportunity to pursue their career or pursue higher education. I think that's important because at the point where we revoke any kind of affirmative action policy, there's still going to be racism, which is undealt with. And despite the fact that affirmative action may be set by racism, which I don't agree with that either for other reasons, but despite the fact that affirmative action may be set by racism or is in existence because of the racism, I don't think that makes it wrong. I just think that it's in existence to hedge against racism.
Okay, we've had everyone say a brief statement. If anyone would like to reply to anything anyone said, please feel free.
I just want to make one. I just want to echo what I kind of said at the beginning. I mean, this is going to tend to a debate. This is not a debate. And I think if we're really going to get to the truth of this, which is what should be at stake, we have to try to let go of categories that make it easy for us to understand the other. And I say that in terms of clarifying my own stance too. I think I may have been misunderstood by Mr. Turner. When I said privilege, I did not mean, it sounds as if his interpretation was, I was saying an absolute privileged status for people in society. That's not what I was claiming. When I say that affirmative action is clearly race privileging, it's a relative privileging for the particular position. And I think we're going to be honest with the issue. We have to at least admit that. I don't think that necessarily tears it down to something so awful. But let's at least be honest. If a person has been given any position anywhere, and if there's two equal people, and it comes down to some final category, it is a privilege, it is a benefit, and that's okay. There are benefits, as the representative from the CWRU said, there are many types of benefits. We can admit that too, but we can also admit that there is this relative privileging, not absolute privileging. It's not an absolute privileged status in all of society. Of course not. That's ridiculous. Society is striving to the fundamental good, and I think that's what Mr. Turner said, and I totally agree with. There's a common good that we're aspiring to that cuts through all this. We're trying to establish a union of the human family, and if we're going to get there, we have to really try to be more mindful about these things, but we do have to at least be honest with terms and be clear with the terms that we're using. So I just want to make that clear to all of us here.
I guess the thing is, for me, is that I'm actually very much in favor of affirmative action because, just to kind of follow up on your point, I don't see people when I'm reviewing applications making a big stink that a legacy member was somehow given special treatment. However, if a person of color receives special treatment, that's where the stink comes in. And so I think it's really important. I think that, we have to be very clear that, as you were saying, Jay, that we keep this separation between racism and affirmative action. Affirmative action is not the resolution of racism. There is no way that you can use that to change someone's attitude about a particular group of people, whatever that group might be. However, within the affirmative action context, there is the benefit that needs to be sought out, and I guess I'm only speaking of the educational benefit, that when I'm sitting in a room, as you had mentioned, that there is diversity, I would argue that there really isn't a lot of diversity here at St. Ignatius. Because if you look around the room, you don't represent society, and you particularly do not represent Cleveland, which is predominantly people of God. And so what's important is that educational benefit, that opportunity of exposure and of learning the difference is really what I think affirmative action is about, be it in the workplace or be it in the educational, in the university setting.
I would just caution the gentleman. The principal of St. Ignatius is not to represent the Cleveland community, but the Cleveland Catholic community. So, as a Catholic, I suppose we represent the Catholic community of Cleveland. Perhaps we do. Although your point is well taken, but I would certainly take issue with this notion of diversity, that each human being is not a diverse world unto himself, that we reduce the depth of diversity to skin color, and we look around the room and we say, we're not diverse, as if I'm not different from Mr. Gibbons because we both have white skin. And I'm wondering at that point, what is the fundamental norm of diversity? And I'm not saying that there is not a benefit to racial diversity. I would be the first to admit that. When I was studying in Belgium, it was immersion. But I would be cautious to reduce diversity to something like skin color, in both aspects, to say that because there is no diversity, therefore we are not different, but also to ignore the importance of the different stories that people with different skin colors can bring. So on both sides, I would definitely caution a reduction of that sort.
I wish we could do that. I would like to say that race matters in the United States. It would be nice if we said we didn't have to look beyond it. But realistically, we sort of said, do you notice the term, he's tall? Race is something that has to be dealt with. Black people, African Americans, minorities have a substantially different existence than most whites. One of the problems that we may have is that we do as a school want to look towards having a Catholic, strong Catholic community. But I think we would also do ourselves a disservice if we became an isolated Catholic island where there was fewer than 1% Catholic, where there were fewer Catholics than blacks in Cleveland, but it's much greater percentage than 1.5%. We have to still deal with each other in the real world. We should be able to see beyond that, but within the framework, that race cannot be ignored. There's one thing to be, I don't like the idea of colorblind. Being African American is very much a part of who I am, as being Catholic is a part of who I am, as from being from Ohio. To say that it should not matter, well, no, it does matter, whether I like it or not.
I would just like to say, as an African American Catholic, coming from the neighborhood that I lived in previously, Parkville Heights, when I went to Mass, I saw very few white people at this Catholic church, which was fine. Point being that the majority of the people I saw there were Hispanic. And in my small parish, I probably knew more Hispanics at my parish than I do here. I don't think we accurately represent the Catholic community of Cleveland, as there are a very little population of Hispanic people here. So I don't think we even meet diversity in that regard either. But additionally, I just think that all across the board, well, obviously we don't make people out of our, that's not control, that's not even a question, but more specifically, social and economic classes. I mean, I don't know what people, how much their parents make and what they don't make, but I'm not even sure if I should assume this, but a lot of my friends are probably a lot better off than most of the Catholic people that I met at my church. I mean, I know what their status is, but I just don't think there would be any diversity in what color, skin, or social economic classes in the ways that we want to, especially when we have such a huge population coming from the suburbs. How can we really accurately represent something from the city if most of our kids come from the suburbs?
I would just like to comment on some of the situations you're saying, Ignatius, that we don't represent the Catholic community here. I think that the reason behind that may be because that those people, like Hispanic Catholics perhaps, who are in your community may be economically prevented, or they think that they can't get into an institution like St. Ignatius because they perceive it as a rich boys institution or something as such. But that I think the way to overcome some people's ideas, like some people who are kind of impoverished don't think they can get into institutions of higher learning. I think that might be a problem. And that sometimes, and perhaps it's also because their education that they're receiving isn't as good. And obviously, I think that we need the improvement has to be made, obviously, for minorities, for everyone. Everyone's entitled really to a good education. I think that's something that, look how much money we spend a year on education here in America, and yet still many people fail. I don't know whether or not that has to do with the poor family status here in America or other social problems. The societal problems we're suffering from definitely have ramifications buried in the race or the religion of the people, which might, I think, have something to do with the fact, the reason why Ignatius might not actively meet the standards that we have for diversity. And also, just like to say that my dad is a male man working, so I'm not exactly rich.
Okay, I'm going to break it real quick, okay? Do we have, I can talk to, anyone have a question they'd like to,
I just want to know why it matters that Ignatius doesn't represent anything. We're exclusive, like everything is exclusive. For instance, I'm white, so therefore I cannot be black. Blacks are an exclusive group to me because I can't be black now. Look, what? So, why does it matter? No girls can come to school at St. Ignatius either. So I just want to know why it matters that we don't represent the social status of Cleveland.
I think one reason why it would matter is that we don't say that minorities black should not allow St. Ignatius. As having been a student here and as a teacher, the biggest problem I've encountered in the last 17, 18 years, how could we bring, if we were interested in diversity, how could we bring more blacks to what we do? It's a question of atmosphere. When I was a student, out of about 360 incoming freshmen, there were about 40 African Americans. By the time we graduated, there were 4. The main reason most left by the end of their freshman year was not academics, was not economics. It was atmosphere. They did not feel comfortable. They did not feel welcomed. I have several people that will come up to me during open houses and afterwards. We visited the school. We like to send our son there. He does not feel comfortable. That's a question of us and our nature. As a teacher and as a graduate here, I'm often ashamed of that. But I have to admit, that is true. The reason I got through this school, and my brother and many others didn't, was that I was an arrogant SOB. I figured I don't have to deal with anybody, they have to deal with me. That's asking a lot of a 14, 15-year-old. Most feel much more comfortable going someplace else where they don't have to deal with that. They don't have to be the one in every class.
I think that does have to do a lot with atmosphere, perhaps a feeling of intimidation. I know that here Ignatius said, I would assume, at least since I have some friends with minorities, there's probably a lot of, I might say, like this pressure or intimidation that they had to, for some reason they had to prove themselves that they're the same. Or I think Ignatius does, at least tries to let them know that that they're the same as everyone else. Race isn't the determining factor for their acceptance here, but that they're the same as everyone. I think that, well, obviously we have to try to treat people equally, and Ignatius, and all the kids, all the students here, including myself, we have to try to treat people equally, and I think it's a shame that some people feel intimidated by Ignatius' atmosphere.
As a student here, and as the former president of Delta Omega, try to bring cultural awareness and try to celebrate different people's cultures. But despite that, even if I were to, as I am a student, I would want more people, different colors to come, different experiences to come, because ultimately I think I learned the most through my experiences at St. Ignatius, not through the classes that I take. Because, honestly, I probably won't retain more than half the stuff that I've learned here. But it's the relationships that I make, the people that I meet, the things that I do, that ultimately make my St. Ignatius experience great. It's the reason why I'll come back in 20 years after I graduate. It's the reason why I'll probably make it to college, is because of the things that I've gone through as an Ignatius student. However, at the same time, I do sometimes feel as if you have more than 3 people who are black, or if you have a couple black kids and maybe a Spanish kid in the class, that's something to be celebrated. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I would feel more comfortable if there were more black people. But however, I do enjoy learning about other people's culture, just as I enjoy learning about European literature and I don't know whatever else things, all the things that we've done in Delta Omega. I've had tremendous fun with that. But as far as just being here, I would love to be here with people of all different colors, opposed to just like 97%. Well, I don't know exactly what it is. 90-some% white and maybe 2% black, because then I feel like I'd be a representative for all the black people, and really I'm different, so I don't know.
Taking it out of the realm of the university a little bit more personally, I think we need to get beyond the concept of skin color. That's not what affirmative action is about. It's really about what is behind all of that. And I can speak very directly to it. I too have white skin. However, I adopted a little girl who happens to be African American. My world has expanded exponentially because of that experience. Now I get to understand, as much as I can understand, what my daughter faces in this world. That she has 2 white parents, but that's not going to help her when her white parents are standing next to her in line at the school, the cafeteria. That's not going to help them when she's sitting in front of a teacher who maybe doesn't believe in affirmative action and thinks someone who's just because they're brown should be treated differently. I'm not saying they should. I'm really talking to the value of that experience. I have gotten to know, my friendship circles have changed drastically since my partner and I adopted our daughter. And what's more important to me is that in that friendship circle, changing the quality of my life, the understanding and the empathy, as well as the anger that I feel, is very different because I have been exposed to the differences rather than the assumptions running the way I came. Does that make sense?
In terms of kids being comfortable here, I want to compliment you guys, because every day when I'm here on campus, I'm in the atrium or I'm in the student center, I am impressed by, and I don't know if you realize the difference between what happens here at St. Ignatius and what happens in so many other schools. Namely, I look around and I see kids sitting together based on everything but race. The black kids don't all sit together. The Hispanic kids don't all sit together. The Asian kids don't all sit together. You guys do a tremendous job of getting to know each other, I think, or at least better than the average school, of getting to know each other and being good to each other. And if there is a kid out there in 2003, going on 2004, who is of color and is not comfortable at St. Ignatius, I think the odds are the problem is probably with that kid. There's no reason why any particular kid can't be comfortable. I don't think. And so those of you that are here, I hope you appreciate what a good job you're doing, being good to each other. And you don't become so racially conscious that you stop sitting with each other based on who your friends are, who your buddies are, and you focus on
things like skin color.
We'll take another question.
I have a few points I'd like to make. Just wanted to throw out there, that as a private school, don't you think that you have the right to use affirmative action? And on the other hand, state-run or government or funded schools should have or should not be able to use affirmative action because they should be all-inclusive, I guess you could say. Also, wouldn't economic status be a better measure than race and sex and any other thing in determining that? Shouldn't they have that instead? Take that whole thing out and just replace it with that. And also, how can diversity occur with people feeling comfortable? You're not going to feel comfortable in a place where there's a mixture where, like, say you're at a table with, people with, every single person has a different background, a different race, a different religion. They're not going to feel comfortable to begin with. They're going to have to get to know each other first. And the only way to break barriers between these sort of things would be to be uncomfortable and to put yourself in a situation that you're not used to. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone?
Well, I think Sean, what you say is definitely that's a good point, and what gentleman from there is important. Exposure is certainly a good beginning, but a good foundation. But what I would caution again, I'm not trying to set up these battles here. I'm really trying to get to the heart of this. Exposure is the beginning, and if exposure becomes the norm, then what we neglect is the interpretive, cognitive process by which exposure is integrated into the life of the individual. In other words, you could take a bunch of people who are different, mix them up and put them in a school. There is no
There's an Adrian BN on campus. If you please come to the Dean of Students office at Adrian BN. And also Tim Conroy, 06, if you are on campus, if you would please come to the Dean of Students office. It's Tim Conroy and Adrian BN. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And there is no guarantee that you're going to have the kind of union that we're seeking. It's a good bet that that's going to be a beginning if the process by which they interpret the exposure is going to take root. In other words, exposure is not enough. It's a good start and it's a good foundation, but we also have to be mindful of the cognitive interpretive process that's going to go on and how they understand that. And so to bring it back to what Mr. Dibbs has said, the great thing about this school is that it is teaching, at least I know in my department, it is teaching the gospel of Christ. And this is the most valuable thing I have ever had in how to encounter another person. It wasn't diversity programs, it wasn't diversity awareness, because these are still human beings and achieving a union and achieving what we all want, which is union of the human family and love. And that's not to say, so please don't interpret me as saying that they're not valuable. I know that that's the thing that we like to do, is hear how somebody says something and interpret it to our own way of understanding and attack it. But I'm not saying it's not valuable. I'm saying it's not enough. The gospel of Christ, as it's taught in our department and in the school by this tremendous faculty, is really where we find the truth of the matter. So we need exposure on the one hand, yes, but to reduce the problem to exposure is to neglect the importance of the interpretive process that happens in the hearts and the minds of an individual. To, on the other hand, neglect exposure is to reduce the human being to an abstract thought. You need both of those. You need the balance. You need the middle. And shout out to my class.
With affirmative action, I think that you judge a person on their skin color, and I think that's kind of being prejudiced if you judge a person on their skin color, because your outside appearance doesn't really mean who they are. It's just how they're born. I don't think a person should be penalized or given extra treatment because of their parents or how they're born and how they just look outside. So that is effective?
Well, I think in a community where there are fewer role models at the upper echelons, if you will, in any organization or any kind of university setting, that's where affirmative action comes in. It kind of comes back to something you were saying, is that it might be that people aren't aware of the options in front of them. And in many cases, that's very true. Like you, okay, my dad wasn't a young man, he was a factory worker. I never knew that places like Case Western Reserve existed and the Harvards and the Yales. That was not part of my world. All I knew that existed was a state school 20 minutes from my house, and so I saw that as my only option. So it wasn't until I went to graduate school and landed a different position, and I'm not talking race here, I'm talking about my own exposure. Because what happened is while I was going to college, I met people who were aspiring to this upper echelon kind of position, whose parents were lawyers and doctors and all of these wonderful things, that up until that point in time, it never occurred to me that that was an option for me. And so what happens is that when you're living in a community where a lot of those positions are not populated, role models disappear. People need to know that it is an option. And the other thing is when you were talking about, schools, and I certainly didn't, please don't interpret it as a condemnation of state nations, because Case Western Reserve has the same problem when it comes to the representation of people of color on campus. But what our job becomes is one of saying we are an option. And that's really what happens. That's why affirmative action is good. Because according to the courts, they're hoping that in 25 years, this will not be an issue. That's exactly what you quoted right out of the Michigan case. Because hopefully by that time, the role model, the opportunity, the existence of something other than what their parents are, is what they can strive to and then make their gains in that way.
I think to add on to that, put back in role models not only for minorities, but also for those in the majority. We run the risk of, if we have very few African American minority students and very few faculty members, there can't be the slide into, well, they don't quite cut it. That many, without having the models not only for minorities to say this is something I can aspire to, if you have very few or no minorities within an elite institution that is thought to have higher standards, then there can be a mistaken assumption, well, if there are no blacks or there are no Hispanics, they don't quite cut the grade, somehow they're not quite as good.
I have an understanding of affirmative action that, and where it comes down to, if there's a minority and a white kid, and they're completely equal in every category, it comes down maybe to the minority taking the spot. I was just curious, I know there's minority schools, the majority of people there are minorities. I was just curious how they would feel like, I'm still against it, how they would feel like if a white kid got in over a minority, they needed to diversify or whatever.
Fine. An example somebody gave me several years ago. So we always have to think of equal, there never is equality. But in one example, someone said if you had if you were a coach of a track team or baseball team, you had two students running. They both at the same time. One has perfect form, one is awful form. Which do you choose for your team for the last spot? The good coach should choose the one with the awful form because he can be trained and taught and will beat the other student every time. All things being equal, being a minority is not being equal. You automatically have disadvantages, or you've had to work harder and do more to overcome just to get to the same level. Someone that's put in that much extra work is going to be better. But again, affirmative action is not race. Affirmative action is a way of trying to address inequalities or lack of access in the past. It may have been due to race, but then you also have all state schools. Someone mentioned it before about state support schools do affirmative action because they will always be equal, they will or must take students from that state. And suppose if you have a good or a better student out of state with an in-state student, all things being equal, you're going to take the student in-state. So what choice choices you make for creating a particular student body or fulfilling a position in employment is what's important. It doesn't become often blacks are taking spots from whites. It's get them in the door and looking at things. What are you going to look at? Look at the whole person, the whole background, what has the person overcome. If you had two people color being equal or the same, you had someone who was from a relatively privileged background and someone that had to work hard going to do your job, you might be more likely to pick the person that's worked harder. Unfortunately, statistics tell us that the biggest preference that anything is given is size. Tall people often get hired more often than not. Men, women, attractive versus unattractive. Color would fall much lower down, but there are lots of things that we tend not to think about.
I think one thing you guys got to remember too is that two equal people coming in the same Ignatians and everything, a legacy kid will get in over the other kid. So if you have a parent or a grandparent that came here, he will get in over someone else regardless. So.
And it's kind of interesting because with what happened in Michigan, one of the next areas of attack is that legacy treatment, because then nobody should take differential treatment. But actually, just kind of come back to that University of Michigan case, now all applications for all students, regardless of size, we tend to be much smaller at case. And so we've read individually all our applications. We don't make a comparison across people. We read within the applicant what that person provides. And now Michigan is doing the same thing at the much larger schools. So if I'm never really confronted with candidate A, candidate B, I read candidate A, make a decision, move on, then go to candidate B, make a decision, move on. There really isn't a comparison that takes place. So they both have an equal chance of admission. It really is, what does that person bring with you? And in fact, there have been situations where we've denied a number one kid in this class with a perfect SAT right out of the door because they brought nothing else with them to the university. But then we had this diamond in the rough kid who was about really working very hard and doing things and taking advantage of extracurricular opportunities and academic opportunities that were in front of them that often you don't see happen in some of the upper end schools, for example. You know, that there's a difference sometimes in the performance between that student that goes to a college prep school versus an inner city public school. One kind of has to work a little bit harder too at times to seek out opportunity to be able to learn. And so that's a really interesting thing to see kind of rise up in an application as well.
To start the discussion here a little bit more and be practical, especially since we have the advantage of Dan. It'd be interesting to hear how Case in particular answers this question. Who is black? Who is African American? Who is Hispanic? I tried to bring some clarity at the top of my handout because we talked about racism or affirmative action. It's really important to define your terms, and part of a limitation of a format like this is that it takes a while for more than even one person, let alone 3, 4, 5, 6 people, 50 people, to agree on common definitions. And yet another term that's been thrown around is minority or, synonym. But who's African American? I'd really like to know. Because it seems to me that in focusing on this, those who are in favor of affirmative action end up doing the same thing that the Nazis and the apartheid government in South Africa did. You have a very practical problem. If you're going to give affirmative action to somebody, who's the somebody you're going to give a preference to? And I'll limit it to racial affirmative action. Is someone black because they look black? Is there a certain way to look black? If someone doesn't look black, but they have a grandmother who's black, are they black? Do they qualify for affirmative action? Should anyone who benefits from affirmative action have to pass a visual test? Is that what affirmative action is? Who's Hispanic? You have to look Hispanic? Do you have to have a Hispanic last name? And whether you're Hispanic or black or Polish or whatever, does that have to be two parents? Does it have to be one parent? If it has to be two parents, do each of their two parents have to be black? One drop of blood in order to be black? As long as you have one ancestor somewhere who is black, are you black? And do you deserve affirmative action? How do you define yourself as white? I don't use racial categories. Race is a social construct that is a clumsy, awkward attempt to get at the visual differences between us. I don't know of a black gene. I don't know of a Hispanic gene. And that's why I'm against affirmative action. To me, there's a practical problem. So how do you know someone's black?
There wasn't a practical problem during slavery beforehand, because the real definition and the practical definition, anyone who considers himself to be black or African American is black. The real world association is somebody sees you as black, like the Louisiana paper bag test. You were black whether you thought you were or not. If you had 3/4 of one grandmother, if you were dark enough and they thought you were black, you were considered to be black. But how does someone in favoring addressing olds like a vote changes or trying to come up with a student body or a group that you're in favor of being compared to Nazism? How is that any different than our admissions committee, which gives preference to athletes that you're looking at giving particular spots or giving an extra look at a particular group? How is that different if you're doing it by legacy, by race, by parish, and by geography? What makes one Nazi illegal and another affirmative?
Well, in that case, we have this thing called an application. And on the back of it, when you sign it, what you're saying is that everything that you've placed in this document legally represents and is a truthful definition of who you are. So what we do is we assume that young adults are applying to the university and therefore will be honest, regardless of religion and, or color or whatever, that they will be honest. And so I can give you an example. There was a young lady last year who is as white as snow. Her father is as dark as murder. Milton, I'm so sorry, Milton. And the thing is that if I had relied on the skin test, I would have said, sister, you're not getting any money. Or you're not getting this. But the thing is that she identified herself as this person. I had to believe her. And so, and I would believe her because I believe that people in general are very ethical. So, but the thing is that in case, whatever you check in that box, if you choose to check the boxes, because that's optional, we believe that that's what you are. It's a self-definition. It's an identity. It's not a skin color. It's an identity. And I know that this is going to bring up, well, then why don't affirmative action if it's an identity? How can I not walk in and say I'm an African American? Well, if that's what you choose to do and you can do it in good consciousness, then more power to you. I don't think you can, but because I know I can't. Yeah, well, no, I don't, but I do know that, in good consciousness, I couldn't do it.
But if we're willing to say in good consciousness people will still be racist, then we should certainly leave room for the fact that they could lie to lie. And I'm not going to say that. I appreciate Marty's point, and I know that it certainly challenges the opposition, so it's going to ruffle feathers. But I think we could really be mindful on that. I think Mr. Turner's response was certainly getting somewhere. Although I don't know if what was the terms during slavery, we still want to revisit that, because certainly those terms of defining race were not fair since they were used to enslave. I'm not saying that those are still not prevalent in society, but I would be reluctant to revisit an age where, even though it still thrives today in more subtle and surreptitious forms, to use those norms to now help us with our race relations. I think what Mr. Judge raises is an interesting point, and I think we need to admit that it's an interesting point if we're going to go further with this. We don't need to resist it immediately and start battling it with a polemic. I think it's an interesting point point, and it's a good point. I'm not saying it's the absolute truth, but it certainly helps us to go forward with this. And I think Dan, in addressing, he brought to light the problem that he has as a college counselor, college admissions representative. And it's a difficult thing. This is what to me, what this brings to light is the difficulty of our relationships in general, and how we've come to this point already where if it does come down to relying on a person's good conscience that they're not going to lie about their race for a privileged status, then we might as well be saying, well, we can rely on them for good conscience, that there's going to be no more racism. Human sin is abundant, and I think we need to be fair and honest with our terms. And so I think the point Marty brings up is a good one, that maybe none of us on this panel should pretend to be able to answer so quickly, but rather admit that it is good food for thought.
I agree that it's a very good point. I don't want to become black. I just don't see many races to become black in the next couple of days. Whoever says they're black.
I agree that it's a very good point, but I think that the point is stressing the race too much. I don't think we'll see diversity just in skin color, but there are problems that are inherent in just being black. There are certain problems that we deal with in just the fact that we come from a certain place. As you pointed out, there's no more slavery. We should revisit that time, but still, those, like you said, those ideals prevail. Just no one chooses that. I didn't choose that when I became black, African, Asian American, but I am, and so I have to deal with those things, those burdens that I face on them. They are different than other people's burdens. I'm not going to say that they're any worse, but I'm just saying that I have worked very, very hard to achieve a level of success that isn't very that high. To achieve the level of success that I've achieved, I've worked substantially hard. And it's not just in the classroom, it's in different areas. And that's because, not limited to, but one of the reasons is because I am black. And when I apply for things, I am that black people who apply for this job. Period. Regardless of theoretically, it'd be great if we could just say that there's no racism, or we should just get away from this racism idea. It's a social construct. But it is a social construct, and we can't move forward until we deal with that problem now. If we're going to provoke affirmative action, we need to replace it with something else. We can't just provoke that and make black people stand on their own feet without eliminating some of the barriers that are pushing us down.
I would just like to deal with a few things before getting to any of Jay's points. First of all, the legacy. To the best of my understanding, legacy is implemented as a way of it's seen as benefit, because if you have a family member such as a brother, as I had two brothers who are here, or a parent who has been at school, that person contributed a special part of himself really to the school. He has given, the school didn't just educate him, he contributed to the school itself, and to it. And so it's seen as a benefit that this person has come, that person has since seen it as good as send a relative or a sibling, or to encourage him to go there, and to hope that it's seen as a benefit, hope that person will contribute similarly and will benefit the school similarly, if not even more, and continue to contribute. And also about say Ignatians being a Catholic atmosphere, I think Catholicism, religion, is different from race, because someone actually has control of a person's control of what religion he is. A person does not have control of what his race is. Now, although this could such a high reason to be used against economic benefits, economics transcend race, and so to give economic help, give educational help or help people based on economics isn't necessarily the same thing as race, because you don't necessarily choose your economic status when you're at the age to get into a school. As for some of the points that Jay was making about that people face problems, I just think that everyone faces problems in this life. And in fact, that racism does exist, but I think that affirmative action also gives way for racism to exist, because people could allow, because since affirmative action gives preference and aids racism over others, it in itself is a variant form of racism, and to get rid of it, I suppose to allow it, but it will exist anyway.
think at this point, it is now 4:15, and we promised people that we would keep to about an hour, and which is fine. I would, first of all, encourage everyone to stay, and if our panel is willing to stay and have discussions and ask the questions. There are several people who have questions. If you would feel free to stay and just talk amongst yourselves. I hope we help solve some or answer some questions anyway. But what I would like to ask is anyone who is ever, please give our panel